So welcome to Unit 10, Personality. We are going to be going over Module 56, Humanistic Theories. And if you're just joining this channel, these slides align with Meyer Psychology for the AP course 3rd edition. They actually are the slides that come directly with the textbook. So this is a rather short module. There are only 3 learning targets. Describe how humanistic psychologists view personality and explain their goal in studying personality. Explain how humanistic psychologists assessed a person's sense of self, and describe how humanistic theories have influenced psychology, and discuss then the criticism that the humanistic theories have faced. So how did humanistic psychologists view personality? Well, when you're thinking of humanistic psychologists, you should immediately go to thinking about Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. They felt like they were offering a sort of third force perspective within psychology that was going to emphasize human potential rather than Freud's emphasis on, disorders that are born out of dark conflicts or behaviorism, scientific objectivity. Humanistic theories emphasize the way people strive for self-determination and self-realization. Okay? Humanistic psychologists study people through their own self-reported experiences and feelings. So this is Abraham Maslow. And what were his beliefs? So he said, any theory of motivation that is worthy of attention must deal with the highest capacities of the healthy and strong person, as well as with the defensive maneuvers of crippled spirits. So his point was, we need to look to those who are having significant successes to figure out and understand human motivation. So he had a hierarchy of needs, and we've talked about this in some previous modules, but we're going to cover it again. It's a really important thing to understand. Maslow's hierarchy of needs begins at the base with physiological needs that must first be satisfied before higher level safety needs, and then psychological needs are addressed. So if our physiological needs are met, we become concerned with personal safety. If we get that safety need met, then we seek to be loved and love ourselves. With our love needs satisfied, we seek self-esteem. And if we are able to achieve a good self-esteem, we ultimately are going to be seeking self-actualization, which is like living up to our fullest potential and even beyond, self-transcendence, meaning having some sort of purpose and identity beyond the self. So how did Carl Rogers, on the other hand, view personality development? So he agreed with much of what Maslow thought. Rogers came up with what was called a person-centered perspective that held that people are basically good and are endowed with self-actualizing tendencies. Particularly in a growth-promoting social climate, people are free to pursue their needs. So what does a growth-promoting climate consist of? Well, 3 things, according to Rogers: acceptance, genuineness, and empathy. So when people are accepting, they offer what is called unconditional positive regard, an attitude of grace that values us even knowing our failings. Also, the concept of genuineness was very, very important for Carl Rogers. When people are genuine, they are open with their own feelings, drop their facades, and are transparent and self-disclosing. Empathy, when people are empathic, they share and mirror others' feelings and reflect their meanings. So what is unconditional positive regard? A caring, accepting, non-judgmental attitude. And Rogers believed it would help people develop self-awareness and self-acceptance. And if you look at this image to the right, this dad is not offering unconditional positive regard. How about self-concept? Self-concept is all our thoughts and feelings about ourselves. And to the answer of the question, who am I? For Rogers and Maslow, a central feature of our personality is our self-concept. If we have a positive self-concept, we tend to act and perceive the world positively. If it's negative, on the other hand, if in our own eyes we sort of fall short of our ideal self, what our ideal is for what we should be, Rogers says we feel dissatisfied and unhappy. How did humanistic psychologists assess a person's sense of self? Well, humanistic psychologists sometimes assess personality by asking people to fill out questionnaires that would evaluate their self-concept. One questionnaire inspired by Rogers asked people to describe themselves both as they would ideally like to be versus how they actually are. something to think about. Think about what you'd ideally like to be like and what you're actually like. When the ideal and the actual self are nearly alike, according to Rogers, the self-concept is positive. So how have humanistic theories influenced psychology? Well, Maslow's and Rogers' ideas have influenced many areas, including counseling. A big part of my I went through many counseling classes in my PhD program in school psychology, and many of the counseling perspectives that I learned about had a big focus on Rogerian therapy. They've influenced education greatly, child raising, and management too. The humanists laid the groundwork for today's scientific positive psychology. You think about positive psychology, think about like Martin Seligman. We learned a little bit about him earlier and when we learned about learning. He took off with positive psychology, but it was sort of these humanists that laid the groundwork for those concepts in positive psychology. So what criticisms have humanists faced? First, say the critics, its concepts are kind of vague and a bit subjective. So Maslow's description of self-actualizing people as open, spontaneous, loving, self-accepting, and productive, is that really a scientific description, or is it merely a description of Maslow's own values and ideals? So the critics also say its concepts, Critics also objected to the idea that, as Rogers put it, the only question which matters is, am I living in a way which is deeply satisfying to me and which truly expresses me? So you could probably see how that could kind of end up being kind of selfish feeling if you interpret it a certain way. The emphasis on individualism, trusting and acting on one's feelings, being true to oneself, fulfilling oneself, could definitely lead to sort of feelings of self-indulgence, selfishness, and an erosion of moral restraint. If you're saying, am I living in a way that is deeply satisfying, which truly expresses me, you could be led in that direction. So a final accusation leveled against humanistic psychologists is that it's just kind of naive, that it fails to appreciate the reality of the human capacity for evil. Faced with climate change, overpopulation, terrorism, and the spread of nuclear weapons, we may become apathetic because we either believe everything will just work out or everything is hopeless. Humanistic psychology, say the critics, encourages the needed hope, but not the equally necessary realism. So we're back to our learning targets already. The humanistic psychologist's view of personality focused on the potential for healthy personal growth and people striving for self-determination and self-realization. Maslow proposed that human motivations form that hierarchy of needs. If basic needs are fulfilled, people then strive towards self-actualization and self-transcendence. Carl Rogers' person-centered perspective suggested that the ingredients of a growth-promoting environment are acceptance, including what he calls an unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. Self-concept was a central feature of personality for both Maslow and Rogers. Some humanists rejected any standardized assessments and relied on interviews and sort of conversations. Rogers sometimes used questionnaires in which people described their ideal versus their actual selves, and he later used those to judge progress during therapy. And finally, humanistic psychology helped renew interest in the concept of self, and also laid the groundwork for today's scientific subfield of positive psychology. Critics have said that humanistic psychology's concepts were kind of vague and subjective, values a little self-centered, and sometimes the assumptions are a bit naively optimistic. Thank you for listening. Take care.